So I think what we've heard just now, ladies and gentlemen, has given us a very good entree into this panel, which is going to be about macroeconomic developments in the region as a whole. We're not going to be speaking about individual countries. And so I can introduce now the panel to you. Also, you might notice that Pawel Kowalewski from the National Bank of Poland, the Narodowy Bank Polski, is here. Unfortunately, Marta Keightley, who's the deputy governor, couldn't come, but she's sent in as a late substitute. Pawel is very keen on football, and he is the late substitute. And she sent me a message saying that she thinks that Pawel is an excellent replacement for her. So that's one change in the program. I'm going to introduce the others in the order that they'll be speaking, starting off with Geoff Gottlieb. He is the senior representative for the whole region, based in Warsaw for the International Monetary Fund. We have on my left a person who's a household name, who's not only the chairman of the Erste Bank here in Hungary and CEO, but also the president of the Banking Association, Radován Jelasity. And he, of course, is also a person who has got Serbian nationality, and he was for some years the governor of the Serbian National Bank. So you're a perfect person to be speaking about this enlargement that we're talking about. David Lodge, he's in the best tradition of quietly spoken Irish men working at the European Central Bank. We all remember Patrick Honohan, who of course was the member of the Governing Council for quite a number of years. They used to say about Patrick Honohan, who was the governor of the Irish Central Bank, he was the bard. He was the Shakespeare of the European Central Bank. And I'm sure you're keeping up that tradition, David, as one of the staff members. Reiner Martin, who is executive director of the National Bank of Slovenia, also with a very strong background. Slovakia, sorry. Also with a very strong background at the ECB. Slovakia, now one of the newer members of the Economic and Monetary Union, but you've also, of course, had a stint at the Austrian National Bank. And that brings me on to Tomas Slacik, who is one of the senior economists looking after the whole CEE region at the Austrian National Bank. So we've actually got a lot of people on this panel and relatively little time to speak about it. So I'm going to ask you to be fairly snappy. So Geoff, you can set a very, very good standard, I think, by kicking us off. You are the person, after all, who's got responsibility for looking at the macroeconomic progression in the region. We heard a lot about resilience. I think that was actually very, very encouraging, what we heard from the minister, but also from the deputy governor, about the resilience of Hungary. Also, very notably, the current account turning around, and it seems as though the recovery now from the upheavals of the last couple of years is going to be actually much more stable and sustainable than what we saw in the period after 2008. So tell us how it looks from your vantage point, from the International Monetary Fund's point of view, Geoff.
Sure. Thanks, David. It's very good to be here. For the outlook, I think it's a moment of turning points, and I think there's three turning points that I would focus on in particular. The first is on growth. We've had a big slowdown in the region. Globally, growth bottomed out at the end of 2022. Growth is bottoming out likely in the middle of this year. We're starting to see a recovery in this region in Q3, but it looks relatively weak. That recovery is driven by recovering real wages. So you see stronger household income amid still strong employment. We also expect inventories, which have been a major drag on growth in recent quarters, to start to turn around. Meanwhile, investment is a bit of a mixed picture in the region, depends in part on how much is happening on EU flows, and external demand still looks weak, particularly for countries that are reliant on Eurozone and/or China demand. So we see a recovery, but mostly below potential next year. So I think growth turning around is one turning point.
Geoff, could I just ask you at that juncture something that Barnabas said, very significant. I think he gave us an outline of what the monetary policy will be in Hungary in the next few months. The IMF has been very solid about the need to keep up the fight against inflation. About 10 years ago, you were a bit soft on that, I think, but you've turned very hawkish lately. Are you advocating interest rate cuts in this area?
So that's the second turning point.
Good.
On inflation, we've had one turning point already, which is that we're no longer in a period of rising inflation, we're a period of declining inflation. But when you look backward, there's a very high degree of correlation across countries in the region on inflation. Obviously, Hungary was a bit separate, but what the turning point that I'm referring to is we're moving from one driven by the supply side pandemic and energy shock period of inflation, in which countries were facing very common shocks, to one which maybe more a function of underlying pressures. And the core macroeconomic driver of inflation is wages. And so that's what we are focusing on in this next period. If you look across the region, you still see nominal wages growing much faster than productivity, which is rising unit labor costs. And those rising unit labor costs are a rising labor cost for firms to deal with. Firms have three choices. They can reduce employment, they can reduce profits, or they can pass on further price increases. So in this next stage, what's so important is that demand remains sufficiently weak that firms are not incentivized to pass on those price increases.
So that means you're not advocating interest rate cuts for the time being?
There's two things that we're looking for in particular before we see significant loosening. One is just more progress on core inflation overall. So the recent data on core inflation is absolutely good. Over the summer, including the data that Deputy Governor Barnabas showed, core inflation just wasn't sticky. So if you look at month-on-month, rolling three-month average, annualized, you just don't see high core inflation. But still, on an annual basis, core inflation is high, and there's still further pressures for wages. So we're looking for more progress on core inflation, and a reduction of risks on the side of wages and expectations.
Okay, well, look, let's stop you then. Let's go over to Radován to get a point of view from a banking perspective, but also a central banker, as you've been. Are you comforted by the message that you heard this morning from our two leading Hungarian policymakers, and do you think that's susceptible to be repeated elsewhere in the region? You do, after all, have a regional hat here with the Erste Bank. And then bringing us onto this issue about the enlargement towards the Western Balkans. You know a lot about that. You have got Serbian nationality as well as your Hungarian nationality. Are you optimistic we can hit this target of 2030?
Let me first maybe just relate a little bit what Geoff has mentioned about the inflation trajectory here in Hungary.
Can everybody hear you? Because I don't think you've got a microphone, have you? No, everybody else has. But or is there a microphone in the house that we could give? But I think you've got a loud, commanding voice. So why don't you carry on speaking, and then you can get fitted up in the meantime? Or is there a roving microphone? No, no, we missed it. Well, in that case, let's go over. We'll keep to the numerical order, alphabetical order. Let's go over to Pawel, because he's K, and so he comes after J, and so he was going to speak. And just turn your attention, ladies and gentlemen, away from Radován as he's been mic'd up, and we'll go over to you, Pawel. The same question to you, basically. Do you think that this picture of stability and sustainability we've heard from Hungary, is that capable of being played out across the region?
The answer should be rather yes, hopefully yes, because who else would be interested in the lack of stability? But the question is whether we are facing sort of a wishful thinking, or we will have to face a crude reality. Actually, as far as our bank is concerned, I guess that we have rather realistic point of view when it comes to the disinflation. We are quite aware that it is a gradual process. That is why, according to our forecast, we expect to reach our target of 2.5% in the last quarter of 2025. But please don't be surprised with that, because I would like to use an opportunity and to focus a little bit on our tradition of conducting monetary policy. After all, I pay a lot of attention to such words like tradition and national sensitivities. In the 90s, when I was starting my research activities as a relatively young fellow, I remember that throughout entire 1996, 1997, and 1998, we were under enormous pressure that we were lagging behind inflation. And indeed, we struggled quite a lot to bring inflation to levels, to a single-digit levels, yes? And we were behind many other countries. And obviously, 90s was a time when there was some sort of a race amongst the Central and Eastern European countries. And when it proved somewhere in 1997 that even Russia managed to outpace us and we were lagging behind Russia, there were some discussions about...
But you're still a bit behind, aren't you? And yet, just taking us through to now, Pawel.
No, but I just want to tell you,
Yeah.
Please let me finalize our point. We managed to bring the inflation, but on a more sustainable basis. Right now, who cares about the level of inflation Poland used to have in the 90s? Everyone is impressed by our real convergence, that we managed to close the gap, yes? So I guess to say that sometimes it matters, it pays off to have a certain delay in combating inflation in order to make it sustainable.
But just tell us just for a moment about interest rates, because we did have this very interesting statement from the Deputy Governor just now. Now, Poland has already started to cut interest rates. Tell us what's happened to the zloty since you did that.
Well,
which was about a month ago, wasn't it?
Yes, this is a classical example that whether we like it or not, and it is in line with your former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kenneth Clark.
Which one? We've had a lot. We've had 6 or 7 in the last 6 years, actually. So Britain has had more Chancellors of the Exchequer and Finance Ministers than Italy has had in the last 10 years. So you have to tell me which one you mean.
Kenneth Clark said that you can't separate politics from the economy, from the economics, but for us it proved to be very painful, yes, because in early September we really decided to offer a very aggressive relaxation of monetary policy by cutting the rate by 75.
And just tell us quickly what happened to the zloty.
There was a short depreciation of the zloty, but all of a sudden when the markets learned the outcome of our elections, the zloty managed to reverse almost entire
and why was
losses.
that?
What can I say? This is just my assumption. Obviously, it's my.
I think the idea was that money would be flowing, wasn't it?
There was one. Then there is perhaps an assumption that the government, which is yet to be formed, because no one knows what will happen in our country, may come to an agreement with the EU as far as the new wave of EU funds, but.
Well, I don't want to get you onto the political terrain, but I did want to just mention that because there are some similarities perhaps with the Hungarian situation. Now, so Radován, you can now be even more loud than you were going to be, and also you have the ability to have thought about the question now for several minutes.
I thought maybe as a sponsor we paid only half. This is why I'm not getting the microphone.
The money has come through into the bank account, I know.
Okay. So I think 6-7 months ago we were not so smiley about the Hungarian inflation when the rate was about 25%. In the meantime, actually, there is only one big question in Hungary. What should be the speed? It's inflation is full under control. A great thing has happened in Hungary. Central bank started to lower interest rates. And what happened to Hungary? Hungarian forints? It's strengthening.
So it's a similar story to what they've just had.
Which is a fantastic thing. You know, there were many times that we increased the interest rate and the forint weakened. Now,
well, of course, it's also a contrast to the euro. When they unexpectedly raised interest rates in September, the euro fell. Yeah. So there's a lesson there, isn't there?
So, and it's not only that they lowered, but basically the vice governor also gave a trajectory. He basically told till February. With a pace of 75 basis points, he's expecting a single digit.
And you didn't know that before, did you, Radován?
Well, we did a calculation already like that one, yeah. So I think the biggest question is now Hungary, how strict they are going to be on this road, meaning disinflation. I do hope that there are not going to be many challenges on this downward slope.
Well, Barnabas did keep emphasizing we are in very stormy waters. He mentioned the word careful, I think, about 16 times. So I think that, from that point of view, is actually very welcome that he did give that approach.
That's true, but the biggest question is going to be once in December the inflation rate comes down to 7% and the reference rate is still going to be double-digit, you know, what's going to be then the mixture of politics and central bank fiscal policy?
Yes, well, we'll leave that to the future. Could you just say a few words about the enlargement, which is a bit of an obsession of mine, as you can see?
I love it. I hope that you will go and tour other countries about enlargement as well. You know, the joke is in Serbia that's every year approximately 60,000 people are joining the EU because that's the number of people who are leaving. And the same thing you can say in Bosnia, the same thing in Northern Macedonia, etc. I think here the question is mainly how, and I think here the issue is to which extent the current function of the EU has to be changed.
You mean the voting rights, the accession to funds?
Voting rights, accession finance, etc. Because obviously you cannot enlarge this and assuming that everything will be functioning.
I mean, I really do think there's an opportunity here for the CEE region to put some thoughts on the table about changing the structure of the EU. There has to be a bargain between voting rights and access to funds and to markets. And I think there's no reason why you or your bank or others couldn't actually put some thinking together. I don't think you have to wait for Brussels. I think the region can do something.
If somebody has vested interest in those countries joining the EU, it's definitely Erste and many other banks which are active players, and also some Hungarian companies which during the last 2-3 years explored the possibility, because let's be frank, Western Balkans is off the political agenda of many of the countries. That's where active players there. And it's basically with the missionary for accession, with so to say, a lot of friendship agreements that Hungary has on the Western Balkans. It is basically one of the countries which is put on the top of its agenda.
That's right. And so when I said at the beginning this Budapest would be a place where serious people come to talk about serious topics, I mean that topic. I don't think you should wait for the European Commission to come up with their proposals and their plans. You're old enough and grown up enough and mature enough and experienced enough as a region to put forward your own ideas and then let that be discussed. So let's go over to you, David, at the European Central Bank. You've got this great task of trying to manage some adoption process for other countries. One's also got to make sure that the countries that are in already behave themselves and set a good standard. Could you just tell us how you see the outlook, because there's still 7 countries outside the euro area, even though they're all members of the European Central Bank as being members of the European Union. Could you just give us a bit of a roadmap to anything that might be happening, say, over the next 10 years for the existing EU members? And then, just to make your job even more difficult, there is this possibility of other countries joining, so the number of adherents in waiting might increase. Just tell us how you manage this very big task.
No. Well, I mean, as you know, all but one of the existing members of the EU have the obligation to
Denmark
join,
being the odd one out.
Have the obligation to join the euro eventually. But and from the European Central Bank side, we would always welcome new members. Croatia joining was a real fillip. Good to have an extra member. Shows again that the project has people aspire to join the club. In the end, though, it's a political. It really depends on the politics. Something the European Central Bank would step back from. We'd wait to hear when countries are ready to join. What we do in a more bureaucratic way is we have a convergence assessment every 2 years. We look at the convergence process of the countries that are outside the EU and judge them against the standards. And those standards are set down in the treaty. That countries need to have proven exchange rate stability. They do that by joining the exchange rate mechanism 2 years prior to joining. They need to have shown price stability, to have inflation rates in line with euro area averages or the best performing.
Just from a purely economic point of view, leaving aside the politics, which we know are very difficult, Poland being one of the countries, what kind of countries would you want to join? Because we've heard some very good pieces of information from the finance minister about the structure of the debt. You want reasonably solvent countries to join, don't you? That countries which are also well in line with the Maastricht criteria. So countries which have got a reasonably low level of public debt, which you do tend to get in Central and Eastern Europe, would be on paper very good candidates, but they may not want to join you. It's this old Marx saying, not Karl Marx, but Groucho Marx, I wouldn't want to join a club that would have me as a member. They may fear that you want to bring them in so you can mutualize their relatively low public debt levels.
Yeah. I mean, I would slightly argue with the way you characterize that. It's not a choice from our side. No, it's set down in the treaties. Everybody knew what they were doing when they joined up to the EU, and we follow the process as it emerges. You're definitely right that the fiscal position is very important. That's why one of the criteria in the treaty is fiscally oriented. Any country with an excessive deficit procedure can't adopt the euro at the point when we make the convergence assessment. And that has two elements. It's not just the deficit, but it's also the trajectory of debt as well. And you know, you're absolutely right. We've learned in the euro the first decade that the dangerous dynamics that can build up from excessively optimistic expectations, loose macroeconomic stance that stores up problems, and we've been dealing with those in the second.
I think that's been very salutary, that weight of history. So we're now going to go to you, Reiner, Martin, speaking for Slovakia, although also with an Austrian hat on. Also, if there is anybody who wants to raise a question from the audience, then I'd like that to happen. I don't know whether you need a microphone or you can just speak loudly, but we would like to have a bit of audience participation. So just try to catch my eye, like in an auction when you're bidding at Sotheby's. Just raise a hand or something like that, and you won't be buying an old master. You'll be able to ask a question. So, Reiner, two questions to you, really. One is that do you buy this relatively positive picture, which we had painted, and it was not in any way denounced by Geoff, although he's being very cautious on interest rates. You buy this picture of a stable and sustainable growth, recovery in the region as a whole. And then perhaps you'd like to say a few words from the Slovakian perspective about the enlargement process, not just the big enlargement that I was talking about with Radován, but also the smaller enlargement, the euro. You've got this large neighbor, important neighbor, Czech Republic, yourself. You're like Siamese twins that have been separated. You might like to give some advice to your Czech neighbors.
Okay, so on your first question, I would very much share that view. I mean, we are seeing now a recovery. It could be stronger, indeed, but we're expecting growth to increase to 2.7% next year and then 3.4% the year after. Inflation is now going down, and I think it's sustainably going down. We have now reached 7.1% on the latest monthly figure. So that is all looking quite good, also very resilient labor markets. So I would share that general view very much.
Do you buy the idea that there will be a recession of some sort? Germany is going through a flatlining process. It's not really a recession. The thought that we had before, if it is a technical recession, it's going to be fairly job-rich. How would you put that into words, this rather minor recession that is expected in Germany? Will that have an effect on your region?
Well, of course it will have an effect on the region. This is clear, because the trade links between Slovakia and the other V4 countries and Germany and Central Europe are very, very strong. This is clear. So if there would be a severe downturn in Germany, it would have an impact, no doubt about this. But let me also get back to your second question, which is about the euro, and I understand also the experience of Slovakia with the euro. And that was actually a very positive one. I mean, if you think about the recent increase in inflation in the region, we also had inflation that was way too high. But within the V4 group, it was still the lowest peak, so to say. And also we had this at a far lower level of interest rates than the other countries in the region. So from that perspective, I think it served us very well. And it facilitated certainly the macroeconomic policy making.
On the big enlargement, 2030 and so on, the Austrian National Bank, we're going to be talking to you in a moment about this, has done a lot of research on the CEE region. You were part of that. Would you agree with me that think tanks, research centres, central banks in the region could actually be a bit more creative and put some ideas forward about what needs to be done from a political point of view? The there needs to be a realignment between the voting rights on the one hand. There needs to be some cherry picking of some sort, I would say, for this. It's not enough just to have long transition periods. I think we could really welcome some thoughts, which I know the region as a whole has for this. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, I think this is something that needs adjustment on the side of those countries that will join or aim to join, and also on the side of the current member states. This is very clear, and I think collective thinking on that would be very welcome. In fact, actually, together with Tomas and the Austrian National Bank, we had a conference right yesterday where we talked about these issues, so the financing requirements to achieve the convergence process and the accession
Well, you've
process.
set Tomas up perfectly now, haven't you? Because that's exactly my point. I know you do have these regular conferences, don't you? You've got a very large batch of very able economists looking across the whole region. I think the regional central banks are very grateful for what you do, actually, and you've got a tremendous outreach. So do you have an answer to this formulaic question? Ukraine is clearly a very large, very poor country with all kinds of structural problems. Accommodating Ukraine, have you got a solution to that?
Okay. Of course, neither one.
You can go on until after lunch as well on this.
This is really a little bit of tough luck if your last name starts with S, right? And it goes in alphabetical order, and then everything has been said, and you are asked a question that you did not prepare for.
No, but you have prepared for it, I know. From a spiritual point of view, you're there. You just have to get it over the line.
Okay. On that question, I would refer you to our conference. I'm not really an expert on Ukraine. I think it's a very complex issue. We had a conference, as Reiner mentioned just yesterday, on this. It was recorded, so please feel free to refer to that. I would like to pick up a couple of issues that have been mentioned here, if I may. Starting with Reiner, I think it is a very interesting natural experiment to compare the inflation performance in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. The former one is a euro area member, and the other one is not. And if you look at the inflation path, inflation performance, not only over the last 2 years, where inflation has been highly correlated between the two countries, they are also structurally very similar. So this is really a very interesting natural experiment. So the inflation performance has been very similar, highly correlated in both countries, and actually in Slovakia, as Reiner said, inflation was even lower at the peak than in the Czech Republic, and this does not hold true only for the last 2 years, but pretty much since the euro adoption in Slovakia. So I'm, of course, not in the position to argue in favor or against euro adoption. This is not my role, but I think it's a very legitimate question to ask what is the value added of autonomous monetary policy, especially in high inflation times like those that we are experiencing now. This is not really just my question. Even senior representatives of the Czech Central Bank are starting, I heard it from them, are starting to ask this question.
Well, thank you very much for making that point. You have set a good standard, I have to say. That actually brings me onto you, Pawel, because of course that's a big issue for your bank at the moment. You are also weighing this up, aren't you, from a purely economic point of view. As you say, what are the advantages or disadvantages of an autonomous monetary policy? And you're putting on a little seminar on this next month, I believe. So could you just tell us, I know it's very finely balanced, tell us the situation just from a purely economic, not a political point of view, an economic point of view in Poland. And then let's have a question from the audience, from somebody after that.
Well, so when it comes to our country, I guess that 2 issues must be taken.
Can everybody hear you? You seem to be speaking a bit slowly.
I will try. So, all in all, just let me perhaps finalize it in the following way, coupling 2 issues in one subject, our monetary policy and the perspective of joining the euro area one day. Unfortunately, here we do not have Czech representatives, but when it comes to explaining inflation where Central and Eastern Europe had to struggle with that inflation, I really like the explanation offered by the Czech National Bank. And let me explain you in more detail.
Look, I'm asking you about Poland.
Well,
we don't have all day either, Pawel.
Yeah, but I just want to summarize and draw conclusions for the regions. After all, the inflation which hit Central and Eastern Europe had to be perceived in absolute terms, not in relative terms. After all, the price of commodities. And imagine, if we pay for a lunch €1 as a result of higher oil prices, so if in Central and Eastern Europe you pay for your lunch €5 and you need to add additional euro to that lunch, so it is 6%, so the inflation is of 20%. In richer countries where you have a full real
so you're talking about the
convergence, the inflation is being reduced to the 10%. So I guess this is one of the reasons why we are so careful in launching any discussions about a premature entry into the euro area and focusing so much on real convergence.
Geoff, do you have a view on that? And then let's have a lady, Mara, I think you should put the question next. So give the lady a microphone. I want to get a bit of diversity from the audience. But Geoff, you say your piece on this first. But can we have the microphone, please? I'd like some diversity from the audience. Is there a microphone? There is one. Yes, good. You've got one. But first of all, Geoff.
On the euro.
Yes, that's right. Getting ready. Would you welcome that? Are you advocating this? You can't speak for the ECB, obviously.
I think our general view is that the types of reforms that you do to get ready for the euro are good reforms to do anyway. And so there's not really a difference between preparing for the euro and not. I think that in some cases, if you have an overly rigid exchange rate already, you've already lost some of the benefits of a flexible exchange rate, and then there's much more net upside to joining. In Poland, they have a very flexible exchange rate and have some of the benefits of an independent monetary policy.
That's right. I think we have seen some of that, and as you've just explained, it goes up and down, doesn't it? Radován, you wanted to say something about that before we go over to our audience.
I mean, one of the strongest side effects of the strong inflation that we have seen in Hungary is that's basically the euro is implementing itself. We have a continuous increase of euro deposits of the private individuals. More and more basic materials, milk, meat, etc., is defined in euros, and they just take the exchange rate. And again, this is only within the country. Then, of course, you have a huge exporting market, etc. So basically, either you like it or not, euro is implementing itself. So
as it was already in Croatia.
Exactly.
That was a very good point, isn't it, really? And it's happening also in Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania. So it's quite right. I mean, David, you must be aware of all that. Maybe you're secretly organising it all. I don't know.
You're
Surely not.
This is not the time to reveal the secret.
No. So, Mara, let's have your question now, please. Yes.
No,
it's a gentleman. Okay, I wanted a lady, but
she works for Goldman Sachs, but I don't. But I am an American.
Right. Okay. Good.
So
good.
this
You're
is
American. Can you stand up so everybody can see you?
Fine.
I think it's important that people can see real life people in the audience.
I just want to ask a question about capital markets union. Does that not increase trade flows, capital flows, growth perspectives? It's been a football for far too long in Europe.
Yeah, okay, well, let's have, I think, Reiner, since you've got experience of a lot of different central banks, you can answer that question about capital market union, because it strikes me that's really essential for Europe.
Well, I think the central banks would pretty much all agree that capital markets union would be a very good thing to have, but it's not for the central banks to decide about this. I mean, this is in the political process of the European Union. And in fact, it has been bogged down by a lot of special interests by a lot of different member states. And I think this is...
Are you talking about, say, the stock exchanges, for example, that don't want to merge their activities?
Securities and stock exchanges. I mean, as you know, it's a very complex arrangement, right? The project would be extremely helpful for the euro area and for the European Union, no doubt about this. And I can only say my personal hope that this will be now restarted and taken more forward more swiftly.
It's essential also for this greening of Europe that we're going to be talking about a bit later on, because you need a market solution there. Yeah. Does anybody on the panel have anything useful to say about this, rather than it's all very complicated and it's all going to take a long time? Yeah, please.
Yeah, let me just give you a personal experience. Yeah. I have shares in Erste Bank in Vienna. I get my dividends. Every year, the Austrian fiscal takes immediately 27.5% off. Then the money is transferred here. Then the Hungarian fiscal takes off a little bit. And of course, the Austrians are telling me, you can, of course, come back and reclaim your taxes. Yeah. The user manual is 15 pages long. Yeah. And voila, this is democracy. You can do that. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, how it works in reality. So nice political talks, nice plans, nice milestones. But when the rubber hits the road, it's basically Austria first, Hungary first, and all the countries are basically first for themselves.
And then there's going to be a new European Commission next year. It'll take them time to settle in and so on. So unfortunately, it's a big sense of déjà vu. Anybody else got anything useful to say on that? So David?
No, I mean, so I would entirely agree that it's extremely useful. And I think the classic way to understand why it's so useful is to compare to the US. No, so if you look at the US, the size of the domestic market should be very similar, but the financial integration is clearly lacking. And you see that appear in the capital markets, in the funding. Venture capital is much weaker in Europe, funding for projects. And it's not just the green transition, it's also digitalization and technology. There are, not to do down Europe, there are strong strengths there, but we're well behind the main competitors.
Well, it also has
in
very
these areas.
strong structural effects. For instance, the fact there's not been any proper, or very few anyway, cross-border takeovers in the western part of the European Union. There have been in other parts. I think it's holding back the size of the banking market. So all these things are linked together. Are there any other members of the audience, either forced or unforced, who want to ask a question? I mean, otherwise we'll carry on very happily just speaking amongst ourselves. Something I wanted to get onto is this issue about resilience. And I was very struck by what the minister said. Tomas, perhaps I could put this to you because you've got a vast amount of expertise at the National Bank looking at energy markets. Hungary, a landlocked country, making big efforts now, it seems, to diversify its energy sources. Could you tell us a little bit about the region as a whole in terms of energy dependency? Because we've all seen how dangerous it can be to be dependent on one major source. So can you tell us anything about resilience?
I have to say, David, I feel a little bit like in my high school leaving exam, where we had been given 25 sets of questions. And
resilience was among them.
I had memorized 24 of them, and I was asked the 25th.
But that's the way you get better, you see, by getting
exactly.
more and more
So thank you very
questions.
much for challenging me on another topic. Energy markets in... and I'll actually then try to bridge to another topic, another structural topic. Of course, countries in the CZ region, several of them, are still very energy intense. And looking ahead, with respect to the green transition, what they'll have to do is they'll have to decouple growth from their CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. What is interesting is that they already managed to do so. There are only very few countries in the world, about 30, that did manage to decouple growth from their energy consumption. And as always in economics, it depends on what you look at. So if you look at the 1990s, this is where out of those 30 countries, maybe half of those are countries from Central and Eastern Europe, where they really managed to grow very fast and at the same time to decouple or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. This is, of course, to a large extent for the low-hanging fruits that they were able to pick back then.
Say closing down lignite power stations and things like that, you mean?
Exactly. So if you look at a more recent period, say over the last 15, 20 years, then they all of a sudden, most of them drop out of those 30 countries. So this is going to be a challenge. Now, the other structural issue that I wanted to bridge to is the automotive industry. And you might be wondering why a representative of a central bank, especially of an Austrian central bank, feels obliged and competent enough to talk about the automotive industry in Central
I'm
and
not
Eastern
surprised at all, because I know that's one of the things you look at very carefully.
Yeah, actually, one of the reasons is that I come from a town in the Czech Republic, in the north of the Czech Republic, where the very first car was invented by Ferdinand Porsche more than 100 years ago, and it was an electric car, by the way.
You have a special car park at the Oesterreichische Nationalbank for your Porsches.
Yeah. The other reason is that about 2 to 3 years ago, we were asked by our governor to look into this structural issue of the automotive industry because it plays, of course, a very prominent role in many of the Central and Eastern European countries already, and in others like Hungary and Poland, the role of this industry is going to increase. So we did that together with the EIB and the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And I think I would highly recommend you to look at that paper because it's very prophetic in several aspects. And one of the, I could conclude the paper with a phrase or a quote or a paraphrase of Giuseppe di Lampedusa's novel The Leopard, where he says, for things to stay as they are, to remain the same, things have to change. Everything has to change. And one of the conclusions that we drew was that it is highly important for the countries to provide sustainable and affordable sources of energy looking ahead. So this is one of the lessons to be...
You've very successfully squared the circle of that question, so thank you. And I think you've also shown that central banks can make a major effort actually in looking at some of these structural transformations in the real economy. So David, I know you wanted to say something about that. Maybe you as well, you looked as though you did, but first of all, David.
I mean, I think the energy security issue has kind of had two macro consequences. So actually, Europe as a whole has shown really remarkable resilience, I think, in adapting to this huge energy shock. Both by reducing demand, but by also seeking alternative supplies, and that's been really a remarkable transformation. What it's left us, though, is that we've reduced our vulnerabilities to Russian pipeline gas. That's been clear. But we have now got another potential vulnerability, which is we're much more exposed to LNG markets, global LNG markets, and I think that means that Europe as a whole will be facing potential for shocks. We saw that Baltic pipelines issues in Australia. We're going to be much more plugged into global markets now, and that means that the potential for volatility in our energy prices may have increased.
Do you think there should be a department at the ECB looking at geopolitics? Because it's very interesting. You have noticed maybe that Ben Bernanke, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, is going around trying to put together a paper for the Bank of England to advise them on how they should adjust their forecasting processes. And he's actually suggesting that more geopolitics needs to come into that in somehow. Are you doing a similar exercise at the ECB?
I don't know whether we're looking for bureaucratic structural change along those, but there's a big research agenda that's looking at the implications of this new geoeconomics, the extent to which geopolitics is shaping trade, financial relations as well, and it's clearly going to be shaping the environment.
Thank you, Radován. And then Pawel's got a question to put.
I just want to relate a little bit. We have seen a picture from Minister Varga that Hungary has built up a capacity of 40 billion cubic meter of gas being able to be imported from different routes for a country that needs 9.5. Still remember in 2006 when the first fight erupted between Russia and Ukraine, things got only political, and Serbia had no storage, and in Serbia from one to another day the gas disappeared. Hungarians helped, thanks God, because they had storage. So when you look, even these days, everybody who has a pipeline is blackmailing. We thought it's only Ukrainians. Now it's Bulgarians.
Yes.
Tomorrow it's going to be somebody else. This is just amazing that even within the family, if somebody has a pipeline, he tries to jump on that, saying, hey, we need a little bit more money.
Well, it contributes the whole idea of the European Economic Community, the European Union, because I do remember there was something in the 1990s and the 2000s called the European Energy Union, and that should be absolutely countering that kind of behavior.
Just imagine, look at the number. You have to build up a capacity of 40 billion in order to sleep peacefully and hope that somewhere you would be able to buy 9.5. 4 times more capacity.
Huge insurance.
Because you just have no idea who is going to blackmail you tomorrow for gas.
No, thank you. And also, I felt the storage capacity in Hungary, he was saying it's the fourth largest.
6 billion.
That's also an area where, of course, you can build in some hedging. So, Geoff, you've got something to say, and then Pawel.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think the reason we're speaking about resilience is because we're worried about fragmentation. And there's 2 types of fragmentation we're really worried about. One is in commodity markets, which is what we've seen in Russia's war in Ukraine. And the second is fragmentation in manufacturing, which is what we mean when we talk about nearshoring, Nearshoring would be probably the result of fragmentation in manufacturing. What makes commodities unique is that it's very hard to relocate production, and demand tends to be inelastic. So what we've seen in Russia's war in Ukraine is fragmentation in commodities, and we've gotten exactly what you would expect, which is higher inflation, much more volatile prices, and the net impact on growth can be less than you would expect because there's winners and losers. On nearshoring and fragmentation in manufacturing, we really haven't seen much evidence of that in the region. The biggest data point on that front is the plummeting in FDI into China, but we are seeing that relocation of production is still a difficult issue.
But just on that point about China, do you also see at the IMF, you talked about relocation, an upsurge in, say, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, because of course that could be quite an interesting countervailing force, could also be disinflationary if you find cheaper centers outside China.
Sure. The counterpart of changes in China seems to be a rise in manufacturing and exports in kind of alternative Asia. It's just that we're not really seeing it in a change in composition of manufacturing exports or FDI in Central and Eastern Europe. We've seen resilience, but we haven't seen a surge.
No, thank you. Pawel, you wanted to say something.
Yes, one question referring to the question coming from the audience.
Is there? Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, referring to the questions we had from the audience regarding capital markets union. How can we have capital markets union if we right now see some reversals as far as the single monetary union? I refer to the decision by Germany to remunerate government deposits with a totally different rate than the other members.
i.e. zero.
Yes, and the question is, according to me, ECB was very lenient as far as this reaction was
I know, but they actually did it in harmony with two very important central banks, Cyprus and Luxembourg.
Yes, but the question is, would ECB
totally
also be
harmonized,
full of understanding had other countries, for instance, Spain or Greece, introduced similar decision?
Well, that's possibly something for the coffee break, I think, to discuss that. Now, we've got 3 minutes and 33 seconds left, so I want to ask all 6 of you, starting off, I think, with David. Always good to start with an Irishman, because they'll be very eloquent, and you'll set a very high tone. In a year's time, we're going to be sitting here having another conference. What would you like to see happening in this region of Central and Eastern Europe over the next year that would give you confidence, let's say, not so much as a central banker, but as an investor? Let's say you were staking your life savings on areas of Europe. You know, what do you want to see so that you bring your savings and your grandmother's savings and your wife's mother's savings and pile it all in the CEE region?
Well, I mean, I think we heard it in the keynote speech. The good central banker in me would always worry about inflation. And if we're looking over the next year ahead, the key question is what is going to happen to core inflation, what is going to happen to wages. And you know, next year, the ideal scenario is that wage growth, although high, has started to moderate, and that it's starting to come down, that wages are starting to be more in line with productivity.
Following what Geoff was saying,
exactly,
basically.
Question number 1. The second question is the extent to which firms are also absorbing any wage increases, because there will be some, you know, there has to be some catch-up in real wages, but the extent to which firms are able to absorb
and not pass it on to the
and not
consumer.
pass it on to the consumer. And those would be the 2 kind of key things we'd be looking at over the next year. And you know, if that's all worked out next year, then that would be.
Well, thank you. That does set a
scenario.
very high standard. Thomas, what would be your answer to this?
I would perfectly subscribe to that. And what I would like to see in 1 year, but I admit that it might be more of a wishful thinking, that the countries get on a sustained, robust growth path again, and that disinflation continues towards targets which are currently still very far out of reach. So I have a much more downbeat view than what we heard in the keynote speeches today when the Vice Governor Varga was speaking about the lights at the end of the tunnel. I'm not sure whether this is not a train. So,
no. Well, that's, thank you for being so cautious. He actually said lights. I noticed he used the plural, lights, several lights. So several trains coming towards you.
There are several cyclical reasons and risks, as well as structural risks and reasons for which this inflation might not continue as we are expecting.
Okay, well, thank you for being so cautious. What do you say, Radován? I'm sure you're much more upbeat.
Well, the best grade in Hungarian school is 5. Yeah? So I would like to see 5% inflation, 5% economic growth. We should get at least 5 billion from the EU that we are long owed to. And I would like to see the 5 Western Balkan countries to have concrete negotiations.
Well, thank you. And maybe Hungary beating England 5-0 in the next football
We did
game.
already once, 4-0. So after that.
Everybody remembers, Pawel in particular, the 1934 game, the golden Magyar. Pawel, if you 1934, yeah.
54.
No, but in 1934 there was also a game. Look it up. I know you're obsessed with the 1950s, Pawel. Tell us what you think should happen in the next year, in a fairly short way, please, because the clock is ticking.
Hopefully, a materialization of the forecast we have done here, but unfortunately there is one issue we need to take into consideration, and so far we haven't. The question is whether we will be able still to enjoy the so-called peace dividend, which helped a lot to keep great moderation.
Not the peace.
Peace dividend.
No,
Peace dividend,
you're not talking about the party.
You try to exploit my wrong pronunciation in English. Thank you very much, David. But today you are, how should I say, extremely pushy. But all in all, some jokes apart, peace dividend cannot be taken for granted, especially for a country like Poland. The war in Ukraine does not seem to come to a close end. And whether we like it or not, we will have to take it into consideration. I'm very sorry to disappoint you with this forecast.
No, I think you're right about that, and that we mustn't close our eyes to the fact there's still no outcome there, and the outcome could be very, very bad. So, Reiner, on that positive note, what are you looking for in the next 12 months?
I would say 2 things. One is, of course, inflation to stabilize, that this becomes really a disinflation process to be completed. And the second one is a resumption of the convergence process. And for that, what we would need is more structural reforms, at least in Slovakia, because our key problem at the moment is a lack of labor, and it's a lack of skilled labor. And I think we need to go in that direction, and then I think growth.
And countries are more able to do that, aren't they, if the environment settles down, which, of course, as Pawel has just reminded us, is by far from being certain, because you do need time and space to do reform. So Geoff, I know everything has been said, but you have the Schlusswort, the denouement, so you're able to take this and throw the story forward.
I'll go in a different direction. I would like to, it's probably a lot for 12 months, but I would like to see a more coherent strategy for dealing with the demographic problem. This is the issue that is raised in every country I go to. It's the aging population is a problem not just for potential growth and inflation, it's also a relatively heartbreaking issue that parents don't think that their kids often have futures in their countries. So this requires much more investment in education and health, better governance to stay. It's not just a function of wages. It also probably requires much better labor force participation, particularly among the old and women, and better immigration policies, not just a function of Ukraine. I mean, this is at the heart of a lot of the challenges that we look at. And there's a lot of focus on fertility policies. So we're looking at keeping a very open mind, but this is a big challenge for everything else we're talking about.
Well, thank you very much for reminding us of some of these really deep structural issues, which I know the IMF is putting a huge amount of effort into, and I think it's very, very valuable. So we've got through the hour here, ladies and gentlemen. I think we've gone through a whole series of topics, some of which were on your study list, some of which were not, but thank you for being so flexible. So David, Tomas, Radován, Pawel, a late substitute, but scored some goals there in the final moments. Reiner and Geoff, thank you very much indeed for taking part.